When you open a document library in SharePoint, the file experience feels very complete. You have a command bar across the top, buttons enable and disable based on selection, and everything reacts the way that you expect it to. Inside Power Apps, that experience usually gets reduced to a gallery and a few buttons above it. It works, but it doesn't feel very cohesive, especially compared to the SharePoint experience. So in this video, we're building a reusable File Toolbar component that brings the SharePoint-style command bar experience into Power Apps. If an app is backed by SharePoint document libraries, those files within your app should feel like they're part of the same ecosystem. And users shouldn't have to learn an entirely new interface just because they're inside a Power App. In this video, I'll walk you through how this component is structured and how you can drop this into your own apps. Let's take a look. Channel members have access to download the apps used in the videos, as well as the YAML code used in the components that I showcase. You can click the join button below the video if you're interested in supporting the channel. Let's first start by looking at our end result of the toolbar. Here we have our component on a screen that we previously built in a video looking at the Fluent 2 breadcrumb component. In that video, we built the breadcrumb component, and we built a simple file browser using the modern table control. With our new toolbar, we can select a document inside of our SharePoint library, and then we can do things like open the document directly from our file browser. We can share this. We can copy the link to then share this with existing users. We can delete the file. We can download the file. We can access our version history for the file inside of SharePoint. And we can also manage access to the file. We're doing this all by referencing the built-in capabilities that SharePoint libraries already have and simply linking to those with our toolbar items dynamically based on the item selected in our file browser. So with an idea of what we're building, let's actually start to build it now. In our app, we'll go over to our components and we'll create a new component called File Toolbar. This is a very simple component control-wise, and really the magic comes from our custom properties. We'll start off by setting the height to 35, and that's basically just the correct height that we need to insert our toolbar control. We'll add a toolbar to our canvas, and we'll first change the padding to small. We'll set the X value to 0, and we'll make the height and width match parent.width and parent.height. Now our toolbar should be roughly the same size as our component. We'll give our toolbar a name here, and we'll just call it TB File Toolbar. Now you'll see when I did that, it kind of popped out of the canvas there, and that's because it set the Y value as 35 for some reason, so just be sure to correct that if that happens to you. If we hop over to SharePoint for a moment, we can kind of see some of the options that we're going to try to create. We have our open button, our share button, copy link, delete, download, and some other ones like version history. The way I've grabbed some of the links that we'll look at today is by looking at the browser tools to see exactly what actions and URLs are being called when we do things like copying a link. In this example, we can see in our network tab that we got this share dialog. And if we look at this request, we can see it provides a URL for us. There's some information in this URL that's specific to our SharePoint site and to our tenant, and that's exactly what we'll make dynamic inside of our component. We can hijack these URLs to basically recreate them inside of our toolbar based on the item that we've selected. We're going to have a lot of custom properties in this component, mainly because we want to provide flexibility based on how we're using this toolbar on the screen. The first one we'll create is the items property, and this will be a data input of type table. This is essentially going to be the items that are displayed in our toolbar. Here I'm going to enter the information that we need for each of our buttons to display in our toolbar. We'll do one together, and then I'll cut and show you the final product. For this one, we'll create our open button, and we'll set the item key as open. The item display name will also be open, and the item icon name will also be open. We'll set the appearance of this to subtle, and we'll make the icon style regular. So pretty much we'll copy this format for the other buttons that we mentioned. Here you can see we have a share button, a copy button, delete, download, version history, and manage access. Now we'll go to our toolbar and we'll change the items property of our toolbar to the name of our component, .items. As we know with the toolbar control, it's responsive by default. So when there's not enough width to display all of the items, they get collapsed into this menu. With that done, we can start to create some other custom properties in our component. The first one we'll create is called onSelect, and this will be an event property. We'll add a parameter to this called item key, and this will be the item key passed in from our toolbar control, which will actually trigger this event property. We can select our toolbar control, go to the Advanced tab, and then to the onSelect property, and we can remove the existing switch statement and instead call the name of our toolbar component .onSelect. In parentheses, we'll pass in self.selected.itemKey, and this will pass the item key from our toolbar over to our component's event property, and then we can handle all the actions from there. Next, we'll start to add our custom properties that are related to the SharePoint site and the library that we'll be using this toolbar in relation to. So the first custom property will be called site URL, and this will be a data input of type text. This will be the full URL of the SharePoint site that contains our document library. Next, we'll create another data input of type text, and we'll call this internal library name. For our next custom property, we'll create one called library GUID, and this will be the unique GUID identifier of our SharePoint library. This will also be a data input of type text. Next, we'll create a data input of type record, and this will be called selected, and this will be where we can input the selected record from our SharePoint library into our component. If you're enjoying this video, get subscribed and don't miss out on future videos like this one. Now with those custom properties created, we'll go ahead and set some default values for these. In our selected input property, this is going to be a record that has a couple different columns in it. And we're just going to put these columns in this record with placeholder values so that when we pass a record into the toolbar component from our app, it has some key columns that it's expecting from that record. One column will be the ID, and that's going to be a number. So we'll just put 0 in as the placeholder for that. One will be title, which is going to be text. So we'll just put in an empty string. The next 3 columns are going to be some internal SharePoint column names. So we need to put these between single quotes and then inside curly brackets. So one is going to be link, and this will also be a text value. One will be called full path. That will also be a text value. And then finally we have is folder, and this will be a Boolean. So we'll put false as the default value for this. Again, these are all columns that you would expect a SharePoint document library to have, but in this case, we're just telling our component that it can always expect these columns when we pass a selected record into it. Now, we don't need to put in placeholders for the site URL, the internal library name, or the library GUID, but I do think it's a good idea to add some placeholders here that show you what values these are looking for. So in this case, the site URL is going to be the link to the site that the document library is in. So when you look at a document library inside of SharePoint, the URL will include your tenant.sharepoint.com/sites, and then after that sites, you'll have a / with the name of your SharePoint site. We can copy that highlighted URL, including the / after the site, and we can place that in here as an example URL. And I've added a note here so that you can see exactly what it's looking for. The next custom property is the internal library name. This one we can get by going to our document library, going up to the settings icon in the top right corner, and then selecting library settings and more library settings. You'll notice the name of our document library is just called documents, but in the web address of our document library, you can see after the site name, it's actually called shared documents. So this is the internal name of the library. You'll see this being different depending on if you've ever renamed your document library something other than what it was originally created with. So we'll just put that in as our placeholder in our internal library name. And I've added a note here to call that out. The last thing that we need here is the library GUID. And so this is the unique identifier of the actual SharePoint library. If we go back to our document library settings, and I bring down the URL bar here, you can see within the URL at the very end, we have this parameter for list equals, and then we've got %7b followed by a long string of numbers here, and then %7d at the end. The value that we want from this URL is actually the value that we've highlighted. So between %7b and %7d. If we were to take this entire identifier, including the %7b and %7d, over to a URL decoder, we could place that in there and decode the URL and just see that it's actually the GUID of the SharePoint library surrounded by curly brackets. So the value we want from this is just what's in between those curly brackets, which is the value between %7b and %7d. So we'll copy that value and we'll place that as our placeholder for the library GUID. And I've added some notes here to help find that in the future. Now that we have all the parameters set up that would feed into our different functions of our toolbar, we'll go to the default property of our onSelect custom property, and we'll insert a switch statement here. The value that we want to switch on is the item key, and we want to switch on each of the toolbar items that we've set up. Now we'll set up the formulas that trigger when one of these options is selected. For the open item key, we simply want to launch self.selected.link. For the share option, we want to launch a URL, but in this case, we want to launch the built-in sharing dialog from SharePoint. So we'll reference self.siteURL, and to that we'll concatenate the following string, followed by self.libraryGUID, and to that we'll concatenate an ampersand with list item ID, and the list item ID that we want to link to is self.selected.id. We also need to set a parameter at the end of this URL, and that will be for full screen mode equaling true. This would normally act as a pop-up on the SharePoint site, but instead we're able to link directly to this from a file that we've selected in our Power App. We're basically just hijacking the URL and replacing parts of it with the input properties from our component. That was a tough one, so we'll do an easy one next, and that's the copy option. So in this one, we simply want to copy self.selected.link, and that will copy the link for users that have access already. For the delete button, we'll insert an if condition, and in this if condition, we want to use the new confirm function. Our confirmation message will be, are you sure you want to send this item to the recycle bin, just like inside of SharePoint? And for our confirm button, we'll set the text as delete. For our cancel button, we'll set that as cancel. And the title will be delete. If the confirm function returns true, then we'll insert a remove function. And this is where, as a placeholder, we'll just insert blank. But this needs to be replaced with the data source when you actually insert this component into your app. We can't remove from a data source based on a property in the component, so we have to edit this value when the component is actually in an app. So in this case, I'll just add a note to replace blank with the data source reference. The item we want to remove is self.selected. So if we click delete, it'll confirm with the user, are you sure you want to send this item to the recycle bin? And then if so, when we've inserted this on the screen, it will remove the selected record from our data source. The download button is another one where we can hijack the URLs from SharePoint. So we'll use the download function, and we'll point this to self.siteURL. We'll concatenate this string to it. And then we'll also concatenate self.siteURL, followed by self.selected.fullpath. Version history is another long one where we hijack the SharePoint URLs. So in this case, we'll use the launch function pointed to self.siteURL. And to this, we'll concatenate the following string along with self.selected.id. We'll concatenate another string to that, as well as self.site URL, followed by lists with a /, followed by self.internal library name, and we'll end it by concatenating this string, followed by self.library GUID, and a curly bracket at the end. This essentially rebuilds the link to looking at the version history of a selected item. Finally, for the Manage Access button, we can actually copy the launch function that we used on the Share option, and we'll paste that down here for Manage Access. To the end of this URL, we'll simply add mode equals Manage Access, and this will directly open that Manage Access window. I've gone through and cleaned this up as much as possible so you can see exactly what's being put in this formula and replicate it in your own component. Now that we've done all that, let's go use our component in our app. We'll go over to Screens, and on this screen I have a simple folder browser that we actually built in a previous video, and we used the Fluent2 breadcrumb component to do that. In this case, we're going to make a small change to the onSelect property of our table, whereas before we were launching the selected item if it was not a folder. We'll just remove that piece of code entirely. Above our table, we'll go ahead and insert our new File Toolbar, and we can see that on the screen now. We already have the site URL populated with our example site, which in this case is the same site as our document library that we're using here. And that also means that our internal library name, shared documents, is also correct, as well as our library GUID. But of course, you would replace those with whichever library you're using this component with. For the selected value, right now we just have these placeholder items. But in this case, we can just reference our table.selected. This will provide the required fields to our component from the SharePoint document library. So let's go ahead and try this out. We'll go into some folders here, and we'll see this book, which is an Excel file. So I'll select that, and I can click on our open link, and that opens the Excel file directly in our browser. I can click the share link, and that sends us out to this share screen. So I could share this with a user, set their level of access, and do that directly from this screen. Again, this opens as a new tab, so the user can use that native SharePoint experience without actually being shown the document library behind the scenes. Click Copy Link, and now the link to this item should be in our clipboard, which if we paste it into our browser, it takes us directly to that. We'll use the delete option here in a second, but we also have the download option. So if I go ahead and click download, we can see it's immediately downloaded onto our computer. We can select version history, and that will take us over to the version history on SharePoint. And from here, we can view, restore, or delete versions. And finally, we can manage access, which takes us into that manage access sharing window. So from here, we can grant access, we can stop sharing, we can share a link, or look at the groups that have access to this. Again, we're not exposing the SharePoint library because we don't actually see the library from this link. We'll test out our delete option. So if we click delete, we have our new confirm function ask us if we want to send this item to the recycle bin. And we'll see that didn't actually do anything. That's because one of the things that we have to do when we insert this onto a screen is to go into our onSelect function. And the one thing that we have to replace is this reference to blank. So in this case, we need to point that to our documents. And now that delete function will work properly. We'll click delete again. And now you can see the file has been removed. Now there are a couple enhancements that we could make to this to make it a little bit more user-friendly. If we go into our onSelect custom property, one of the things that we might want to do here with something like our copy function is actually notify that the link has been copied. So if we just take the text from the normal copy link button inside of SharePoint, we can notify that the link was copied successfully. Now when we copy the link, it'll pop up that notification. We can test out the responsiveness of this by going into a phone view And now we can see that these items get collapsed into the ellipses on the right-hand side. And if we click into those, we can see those listed here. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that these buttons are active while nothing has been selected. So one of the things that we might want to add in that case is the item disabled property on all of our toolbar items. In this case, we would want the item to be disabled if there's no selected ID within our toolbar component's selected property. So I'll copy that onto all of the items of the toolbar. Now we can see in our app, these options are blocked unless we actually have a selected item in our table. When we haven't selected an item, we can't click any of these, but as soon as we select an item, we have the option to take action on that item. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this look at recreating the SharePoint toolbar inside of Power Apps for SharePoint document libraries. There is some setup that's required with getting the URL, the library name, and the GUID every time you want to use this component, but I think the experience is beneficial to keep it in line with the experience that users are used to inside of SharePoint. Some enhancements that you could bring to this component would be allowing for things like multi-selection, so that you could take action on multiple of the files inside of a table or inside of a gallery. That could be pretty straightforward with adding something like a selected items field, similar to how we work with selected items inside of combo boxes. Give that a try and let me know how it works out for you. If you have any questions about this component or the techniques that we used tying into SharePoint here, leave a comment below and get subscribed for future videos like this one. I hope you enjoyed and have a great day.